أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم Assalamu alaikum, brothers and sisters. Today we are going to talk about the mystical realities surrounding death. Everyone's life is subject to a beginning and an end. In the world Shahada, the beginning of life corresponds at the moment of birth and ends at the moment of death. However, this does not apply to saints who have the possibility to choose the date of their birth as well as that of their death. Even after this so-called death, they have the power to be present in the world Shahada. In their eyes, only a thin veil separates the Barzakh world from the terrestrial world. It is for this reason that it is important for the disciples to respect the recommendations made by their holy guides during their lifetime. Because after their passing, God gives them the opportunity to intervene mystically in this world. Also, they have the ability to make their lives difficult if the commitments made to them after their death have not been fulfilled. When the life of an individual comes to an end, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decides the circumstances of his death. For some, it will be a car accident, a short or long illness, and for others, it will be a natural death occurring during their sleep, for example. The angel of death has no decision-making power over the process. He just waits for the time indicated by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to collect the soul of the individual. Even if, for some people, death involves illness, this does not mean that all illnesses leads to certain death. When an individual is in a state of agony, with no possible return to life, his finality is death. However, some may agonize for a very long period of time. What happens when the sick individual is living his last moments? Two cases arise when a dying individual is on the verge of death. The first concerns the Muslim who is destined for paradise. When his soul begins to detach from its carnal envelope, its toes cool as if to save it from all pain. Little by little, this freshness rises to the level of the calves, then from the knees to the waist. At this stage, the person loses the use of his lower limbs. Indeed, any part of the body affected by this freshness becomes paralyzed, inert. The soul continues to detach itself, and once the freshness reaches its abdomen, the individual no longer feels hunger. When this freezing freshness touches the heart of the individual, the latter feels as light as a feather and feels like he is floating in the air. Undeniably, the heart hosts the soul of all of the individual. This feeling of lightness indicates that the soul is released from the body and begins its ascent to the sky. At that moment, we can affirm that the individual is now deceased. The soul then begins to observe the body it has just left, in which his loved ones are busy staring at that time. The deceased is informed that his real existence is materialized by his soul and that the body was only a simple blanket. Now, let's talk about the person destined for hell, or who must first taste the punishment of the grave before being forgiven. Because yes, Allah can choose to punish a person in his grave for a given time, or forever, like the case of Pharaoh. We also should note that few people will escape the punishment of the tomb. In fact, many characters or acts can lead to the torment of the grave, such as pride, vanity, or even the absence of purification after natural needs as recommended by the Prophet peace be upon him. For these ones, their grave will be plunged into darkness. Hence the importance of maintaining a state of purity at all times, even if it is not a religious obligation. The agony of the individual who will experience the punishment of the grave takes the form of heat, felt from the toes when the soul begins to leave the body. The intensity of this heat differs according to the fate of the dying. This will be more ardent for the one destined to spend the rest of his existence in hell. It will be less painful for the one who must first undergo a punishment before joining paradise. This heat rises along the body, giving the impression to the dying to bathe in a furnace. When it touches the heart and the soul is almost freed, the individual experiences a feeling of intense thirst. At that moment, he feels like he is sinking into a hole formed at his feet and begins to grab onto the people around him to get out. This explains why most dying people shake the hands of their loved ones very hard. Unfortunately, he continues to sink again and again until his head is completely buried in the ground, marking his death. Therefore, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala clearly shows to the dying that the feeling of being blown by a wind towards the sky is actually a benefit for him. On the other hand, those who see themselves buried or absorbed by a black hole resist by grabbing themselves so as not to be dragged into a pipe lined with fire. During this vertiginous fall, the dying see creatures like dragons spitting fire at high speed. This race towards the abyss ends when the body is buried. The deceased then reaches a bottom. It will be noted that as long as the preparations to bury the deceased last, he will continue to experience this feeling of falling into the dark depths until finally touching the bottom. Munkir and Nakir arrive to question the deceased. In case of wrong answers, he sinks deeper into the depths of the earth under the blows of torture by the two angels. The depth he reaches depends on the degree of punishment his Lord wants to inflict on him. He can reach hell or be close to it, or find himself near creatures such as dragons, snakes with open mouths ready to devour him. Otherwise, he can land in a very dark, warm, and narrow cavity. The place is so narrow that it is impossible to move any part of the body. The deceased sweats profusely there because of a suffocating atmosphere. Breathing is difficult, and exhaled air causes soil to enter the nostrils. Hence, the urgent need to control breathing at the risk of being buried. In this environment, the deceased loses the use of the voice as well as the notion of time. He stays there without eating or drinking, not knowing if he will ever be rescued. Such will be the punishment of the grave. Then comes the times for regrets. Regrets for not having followed a spiritual guide worthy of the name. The process by which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala passes the deceased, whether he is a believer or not, must push each of us to choose a guide approved by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because of the punishment, and the first of the guides is the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. This text is drawn from the teaching of our honorable guide, Khutb al-Akhtab al-Kabir, Mawlay Sidi Muhammad al-Sheikh. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuhu.